All right. Hey, everyone. My name is Dan Kim, and I work at a company called Basecamp in Chicago. And at Basecamp, we are lucky enough to work on a 100% Kotlin Android app. But it wasn't always like that. Just like everybody else, we had a pure Java app for a long, long time. And over the course of the last year and a half or so, we worked really, really hard to move all of our code over to Kotlin. So I wanted to share some of the things that we learned, some of the strategies and tips, so that hopefully you can have as much Kotlin in your code base as well. Before we jump into that stuff, let's just talk about why Kotlin is important to us, and specifically why it's important to me. Prior to writing any Kotlin, I had been writing Java for well over a decade. And I had written server-side web apps, Android apps, all sorts of really cool, great stuff. And it was fine, right? Java, I didn't love it. I didn't hate it like some people do. It was just sort of like a tool that I had, right? It was just this thing that was a means to an end to let me do some of the stuff that I wanted to do. But with Kotlin, Kotlin has been different for me. Kotlin, I was just blown away by how good it was, how easy it was, how interesting and exciting it was. So I was genuinely excited to work on Kotlin once I started getting going. And the reason I was excited to work on Kotlin was that it made me happy, which is a super weird thing to say about a programming language. It's like, oh my God, it made me happy. That's kind of cheesy. The thing is, the reason it made me happy was because it made my work better. It was so clear and so concise. It just has so many conveniences built in that I had this just excitement and energy that I just never really felt with Java. And so it made my life so much easier. I was just really happy about it. And so I sort of, at that point, made it my implicit goal that I didn't really want to write Java anymore. So that I wanted to write Kotlin forever, or for the foreseeable future at least. The thing was, that's a really nice goal to have, but I had no idea really what I was doing, right? I was just kind of running into the unknown. I had no tactical or strategic perspective. I had no idea to kind of get to this goal of like, I just want to write Kotlin all the time, especially at my day job. And what I realized looking back on it was that there were sort of three broad categories of these unknowns that kind of made me nervous. One was, how do I learn the language so that I can get better at it, get faster at it, be more effective with it, and do that in a way where I'm still shipping work, right? All of this is based on the fact that I need to do this while I'm working. So I'm not going off to like a 3-month boot camp to learn the language. I'm doing this at work. I have to be able to ship bug fixes, new features, all of that stuff. So how do I do that in a way where those two things are balanced? Secondly, how do I convert this huge backlog of Java that we already have, and again, continue to ship new work? Right? We had something like 18,000 lines of existing Java. Right? So it's one thing to say, I'm going to create new stuff in Kotlin. It's another thing entirely to say, how do I get all that old stuff sort of moved over to Kotlin? And again, how do I do this in a time-effective way? How do I do this in a way that lets us ship actual work? And then lastly, what are the pitfalls we should watch out for? Like, what are the mistakes I'm probably going to make? What's going to slow us down? What's going to slow down my learning? And in the worst case, what's going to make the code actually worse than it was with Java? And so these are sort of the three buckets of concerns. And that's kind of what I want to talk to you today, is that I want to give you some practical, low-stress strategies on how you can achieve these things, right? How you and your team can get to as much Kotlin as you possibly can without getting stressed out. And a lot of it is around how we sort of approached our work, how we planned our work, and how we used our time effectively. It's not really about the nuts and bolts technical stuff. A lot of that stuff you can figure out through Stack Overflow or blog posts and things like that. This is about how you work as a team to get more Kotlin into your code. OK, so let's get into it. First, start with small conversions, right? Don't start off with something brand new, a brand new feature where you got to write everything from scratch and you have no sort of prior art, right? It's too much to deal with when you're first starting off. The great thing about converting existing Java over to Kotlin is that it lets you verify known behavior, right? When you take a piece from Java and you move it over to Kotlin, you know exactly how it should work. And probably you have unit tests to back it up. The other thing is that if it's small, not a huge piece of code, if it's small, you sort of can do it over and over, right? You can sort of build up this muscle memory, and you sort of get this momentum. And that's important to be able to do it over and over in practice, especially when you're first starting off. So we'll start building up that momentum by doing small pieces. So the next sort of logical question would be then, where do I start? And a lot of times, this is where people will suggest, hey, you should write a test, right? Tests are very small and isolated, and if you break them really badly, it won't hurt anything. But I say no tests. And the reason I say no tests is that, to me, they don't feel real. They're sort of not that exciting, and they're sort of ancillary, and they're not really like a part of your real app. They support your app, and they're important, but it's not necessarily the first place I would start to get a feel for Kotlin. And the thing is, because they're not exciting, it just doesn't give you that sort of momentum that you need. I remember one of the first things that I wrote was an adapter for a pop-up list. And I'll never forget the feeling of when I pressed the button on the screen and I saw the view come up and everything worked, and how that made me feel. And that was exciting. And I've literally never got that feeling when I wrote a test. When I get a test that ran, I was like, cool. But I was never jazzed about the fact that I got something working. And getting excited is important, because getting excited keeps you motivated. It's much easier to learn when you're excited, when you have that sort of energy to keep going forward. If you think about when you were ever in school, if there was a subject you really, really liked, you probably did better at it. You probably learned a little better. You probably got through the harder parts a little bit smoother. And if there was something you weren't into, it was probably not so good. You probably weren't into it. So as I'm done bashing tests, if it's not tests, what would be a good place to start? So models are a really good place to start. They're super small. They're isolated. They typically don't do a lot. But they still give you some perspective on nullability. They give you some perspective on maybe how to handle default values in Kotlin. So, and they're a real part of your app, right? You know that they're inflating real lists and other views inside of your app. So models are a very, very small way you can start, but a good sort of starting point. The next thing are utility methods, right? It's just a next sort of small step up. Again, they're fairly isolated. They might be touched in a few different places, or they might be used in a few different places, but they're small, and they don't necessarily do a ton of stuff. Obviously, they have a little bit more going on than a model, and they have logic and other things in them. So that's a nice sort of next step up, is that you start converting a few of your utility methods. And then when you're ready to kind of go to the next step, you can try out doing like an adapter, right? Like a list adapter, any kind of data adapter. These typically have a little bit more going on, certainly more than your utility method, but they're not so complicated, right? They're still fairly isolated in what they affect in your app. Basically what I'm saying is don't start off with your entire retrofit implementation in your first week or whatever, right? Give it some time. Get your feet wet, get moving on this stuff, and sort of build up to the harder stuff. Next, forget about being perfect. So one of the phrases you will hear all the time when you're starting out is this phrase, idiomatic Kotlin, right? And all it really means is it's sort of the natural, preferred way of writing Kotlin, right? It's sort of like these are the best practices that you should follow. And you hear it a lot because Java and Kotlin are pretty similar languages, right? There's certain ways that you write Java that you probably wouldn't want to write that way in Kotlin. I mean, you certainly could copy it over and it would work, but it's not necessarily the best way to do it. And these are good things to think about. The Kotlin idioms are awesome, and they're part of the reason why Kotlin is such a good language to work with. The thing is, you don't want to get too caught up in it, right? If you try to be too perfect out of the gate, you will stall out super fast. You will get demotivated, and you will just stare at a blank screen and say, I know how to write this in Java. It's taking me 4 hours to do this. Why am I even bothering? And you don't want that to happen, right? It's just like anything else you've ever built, any other piece of code you've ever written. You got to get it working, you make it better, and then you make it great. So don't get too caught up in saying, I have to follow the idioms, I have to do it perfectly, right? If you do that, what's going to end up happening is that you're going to find yourself in some serious rabbit holes. And I know this because I did this a lot. And the best way, I just want to show you a quick code example of kind of thing that I would get stuck on when I was first starting off. So here's a Kotlin method. It's not what you would call idiomatic Kotlin, but it's technically Kotlin, and it works fine. And what would happen to me is that I would look back at something like this, and I would write it, and I wouldn't even get it working yet, but I would write it, and then I would start to sort of pick it apart with all the things that am I following all the right idioms? Am I doing this perfectly? So I would look at this and say, oh, this for loop, I'm pretty sure there's a better way to do that. I think there's something in the Kotlin extensions. Let me go through all the documentation and figure out exactly how to write that. And then I'd move on and say, well, there's this if-else block, and I can write that better. I'm pretty sure there's a flow control method, maybe a when block, and I can do it with that. Then I look at the double bangs, and I'm like, well, nullability is a huge thing in Kotlin. I have to address that now. Then finally, or again, I'm looking at the account object. I'm like, well, this is just a model. I should convert it to a data class. Now I'm 4 levels deep in this rabbit hole, and I still haven't done anything. And then finally I look at this, and I'm like, oh, all this could be an extension function. Great. Now I got to go look at how those work. So I'm familiar with all these concepts, but like 4 hours later, I haven't done any work. I'm just this dog. I'm just looking at the screen. I have no idea what I'm doing, and I haven't shipped any work, right? So again, the idioms are important. That doing it sort of the right way is a good thing to keep in mind. But don't stall out. Get out of your head about it. You will always, always look back at your code from 3 months ago, 6 months ago, a year ago, and you will laugh at it, like hysterically. I mean, I think I pulled that code because I found it in our code base, and I was laughing at it. So don't worry about it. Don't try to be perfect. Just get moving and get something on the screen. So Kotlin is a big thing. It's a language. And you might be overwhelmed when you first start, because there's a bunch of stuff you could learn. The trick is you really only need to know maybe a few things to really get yourself going, right? If you just learn a couple concepts, a few key concepts, you will get much faster and much better with the language. And the reason for that is because all the concepts in Kotlin, once you start to understand how it was architected and some of the ideas behind it, they all start to work together, and they kind of click together. So if you just kind of nail down a couple idioms and a couple concepts within Kotlin, you will feel much better with it, and you will get much better with it very quickly. And when I have this asterisk for you, I really do mean for you. I don't mean what your coworker says is cool. I don't mean the stuff that I say is cool. I mean the stuff that when you see it, you're like, aha, I see exactly how I can apply that in our code. I understand how it works, and I'm excited to apply that because I can see how it's going to make a big difference in our code. So after I say don't listen to what other people say, let me give you some ideas of the stuff that did make sense for me. So one of the things that made a lot of sense for me was flow control, right? How Kotlin handles its ifs, whens, and looping is just very tidy and neat, and it's just a really nice thing that you can apply everywhere, right? Obviously, we all have flow control in our apps, and if you kind of just get the hang of these, they're not hard. And once you get the hang of them, you can use them all over the place. And it's just a nice sort of small thing to understand when you first start. The next is collections, and how Kotlin has a very large library of collection extensions, basically in the standard library. And they let you do all sorts of awesome things like filtering and sorting and finding objects within those collections that make life so much easier. So if you're looking for something to just make your life easier, collection support is where you want to look. And then extension functions. They're just so powerful. You can basically make any object your own, and you can extend off of them and do whatever you want. It's so much better in terms of readability, so much more declarative when you can just call a method upon an object that you don't necessarily own. So these were 3 things that clicked for me, and I just started using them all the way through our code. And that was a great starting point. That was a great way to learn. And then later, I started learning about some of the more advanced concepts. But just pick a few things that work for you, and then kind of go from there. Next, the autoconverter is your friend. So I'm assuming at this point, maybe you know what the autoconverter is. If you don't, it's basically just a plugin provided by JetBrains that will convert any piece of code that you put inside a Kotlin file. You can copy it into a Kotlin file and convert it to Kotlin. Or you can convert an entire file, and it'll go to Kotlin as well. And so it's a sort of a machine version of what it will think what it should be from Java to Kotlin. And it's a super fast, great way to get a bunch of Kotlin into your code base. So at this point, you're probably saying, all right, great talk, Dan. Like, I can just go home and use the autoconverter. Let's go to the reception. Can we be done with this talk? But there's a little bit more nuance to it than that. First is that the autoconverter is actually a really great tool to do side-by-side learning, right? So one thing that I would do a lot when I was first starting off is I would take a copy of the Java file that I was going to convert. and then convert it, and then put them side by side. As soon as you run the autoconverter, the Kotlin converter will delete the Java file because it doesn't ever want to see Java in your source code. So you put them side by side, and you can learn a ton by doing this, right? You can learn sort of block by block. You can see like how the machine decided to convert this thing, or you can do line by line and just get an idea of what one version of Kotlin code, of your Java code in Kotlin will look like. So this is a really great way to sort of get the ball rolling again in learning some of the language features. The thing is, you're only like 60% of the way there. And Josh talked about this earlier in his talk this morning. Think of the autoconverter as sort of like a moving company, right? Like they help you move all the big stuff, they move all the furniture and the big boxes, but they don't unpack it for you. They don't arrange your furniture. They don't do any of the small stuff, right? And so the autoconverter doesn't understand your business logic. It doesn't understand your conventions. It makes mistakes. It does all sorts of stuff. And ironically, it doesn't even follow the idioms really, right? It just kind of does the most basic conversion, as it should. It's a machine version. It can only do so much. And so it's up to you to take it to the finish line. And what's really great is that those few concepts I was talking about, those 2 to 3 concepts that you've sort of been working on, it's a great time to apply those here, right? So now you've done your auto conversion. It's given you this huge head start. It's gotten you like 60% of the way there. Now you can take those things like write extension functions, work on the flow control, just make the code a little bit nicer. It's a great way to sort of, again, learn as you go, but not have to do all of the grunt work. Next, use cooldowns for Kotlin. So we talked about the autoconverter and how it gives you this big head start and how you can kind of get really flying with it. The question is, when do you do that work, right? You're still shipping features. You're still doing all this work. When are you going to do it? And what we found is that doing it during cooldowns was probably the best time, or when we got the most of our conversions done. So the way that we work at Basecamp is that we work in roughly 2 to 3 week cycles. And in those 2 to 3 week cycles, we ship out a fairly big feature to customers, right? When we're done with that feature, we basically schedule time as a cooldown for roughly, let's say 3 days, 3 to 4 days. And in that 3 to 4 days, what we do is we kind of just keep an eye out for crashes, keep an eye out for custom reports, bug reports, and things like that. And then the other thing we wedged in there when we were in the middle of our Kotlin conversion was Kotlin conversions, right? It's a great time to get Kotlin conversions done, right? If things have gone smoothly and you don't see a lot of crashes and you don't see a lot of bugs, you have this little scheduled period of time where you can convert a bunch of Kotlin, or a bunch of Java over to Kotlin. We made huge strides doing it this way. If you schedule a couple days when you're cooling off and your brain needs a little rest and you just kind of want to do some fun work, doing it during cooldowns is one of the biggest ways that you can get much further with getting Kotlin into your code base. Next, no new Java ever. So I fully admit this sounds obvious. If your goal is to get further along with Kotlin, you probably shouldn't write more Java. But you would be surprised, and I mention it because it happened to me and it happened to us a fair bit. Right, all these things are going to be working against you. Things like deadlines, obviously, right? You're going to have this period of time where you can say, I can write this Java in like an hour, or I can go spend like 3 hours trying to write it in Kotlin, right? You're still trying to like figure it out. So you have all these pressures that are going to be working against you. Things like deadlines, things like incompatibilities, right? I guarantee you're going to run into something with a library or a piece of code where it doesn't work exactly perfectly, and you're going to want to bail and just be like, I'll just write it in Java for now, and I'll come back to it some other time. Or maybe you're just lazy, like we're programmers. Sometimes we're lazy. Like I think we can all admit that. So these things will sort of work against you. I bring it up for 2 reasons. One is if you can at all avoid it, if you have the time, do try your best to do this. But again, if it happens, it's not the end of the world. Just try your best. If you add to the pile of Java, it's obviously never going to get any smaller. So just try your best to try to get past this. One of the periods of time where this happens a lot is when you're sort of incidentally passing by a piece of Java code when you're writing something new. So you might be writing a new feature and you have a model or a utility function and it's in Java. And all you got to do is just go in and just make one little tweak to that utility method, or you got to add like an attribute to the model. And you're just like, I'll just leave it. I'll just add a thing and I won't convert it and I'll just kind of move along. But you should take the time to convert those. Those little small changes, those little small conversions made a huge difference, again, to how quickly we were able to get more Kotlin into our code base. And this is super important for helping your teammates too, right? I can't tell you how many times that I was working on something and then I would look for the corresponding class and it was already in Kotlin. Like that just makes your day as a teammate. So leave the campsite cleaner than you found it. If you can at all afford it, convert stuff over to Kotlin as soon as you can if you're passing by it. Don't be lazy about it. Try to take care of it while you're there. Okay, so we've kind of up to this point talked about how do you learn the language more effectively, how do you learn it more quickly. We've talked about how do you kind of get more Kotlin into your code base. The next sort of section of this is I want to talk about some things to just kind of keep an eye out for. Some of the mistakes you might make, some of the things that you should just be aware of. And one of those things is that things might get a little ugly in your code. This is sort of like the awkward teenager phase of your code base. The stuff you can sort of expect to see is that things are not going to be perfectly dry. You're going to see weird call sites in Java with like companion objects and all these other kind of weird things. Or you're just going to write certain things in Kotlin that just look ugly because you don't know how to do it any better, right? Don't sweat it. This happens to everybody. And it almost always happens when you get to like some tipping point with your Java and Kotlin. Maybe you're at like 30, 40% Kotlin. You start to see this like balance of stuff, and everything just starts to feel a little weird. I bring it up because I want you to know that everybody's gone through it, just like being a teenager. Everybody's gone through it. Everybody's going to have to go through it. So don't sweat it. At Basecamp, we had this horrible thing where we had base classes. Our base activities and our base controllers were written. We had one set that was written in Java, and we had one set that was written in Kotlin. And all of our Kotlin stuff was extended over here, and all of our Java stuff was extended over here. We basically had duplicate codes of some of our most important classes. So it happens. We just had to deal with it. We didn't like it. There was nothing we could do. We could have extended everything off of the new Kotlin stuff, but we were tweaking stuff and changing stuff, so it just wasn't worth it. So again, just be aware. Just let it go. It'll be fine. It's a passing phase, and eventually, once you get more Kotlin in, it won't be a big deal. Curb your enthusiasm. So when you start to feel comfortable with Kotlin, you might get a little excited. You might start to do a bunch of stuff that you don't necessarily have to do just because you want to use all the tools that are available in Kotlin. It gives you a bunch of cool stuff, gives you immense flexibility, and it gives you an immense amount of power that you can write things in a very specific way. And so it's very easy to go overboard. I had this weird thing where I just really enjoyed cutting lines for some reason. It was just a big deal to me. Like if I could say, oh, this Java was 120 lines, and I converted it to Kotlin and it's 80 lines, that just made me happy. And typically that's a good thing, right? It just means your code is concise and clear and probably nice. But the thing is, I'd go way overboard, and I would just make everything way too concise and bordering on terse. And so be aware of some of these things that you can sort of get seduced into, and just try to keep an eye on those things. Let me give you a code example of something that happened to me. So this was a single line expression function I wrote at one point. This is horrible. So if you can, and this was on one line. For the sake of the slide, I couldn't put it on one line, but this is technically in one line. And if you can parse this without thinking really hard or getting a brain cramp, you're definitely a better programmer than I am. So this is bad. Here are all the reasons that it's bad. One, I can't tell what this is returning, right? Single expression functions are nice, but it's really hard for me to tell if this is returning or if it's just running. I got two lambdas in here. I have a do async inside of a with. Not great. Nothing wrong with it, but it's just hard to read. I have this extension function called without pings. So I'm pretty sure I know what it does, but I don't really, so I have to click into it and go to the method to see what it's actually doing. So it's a little bit harder for me to grok right here. And then I have this kind of weird this at with object reference, which if you're new to Kotlin, you're probably like, what the hell is that? So this is not good. And this was me being obsessed with doing stuff in one line. This is me being obsessed with using with for some reason. You don't have to do that. You have all these things that are great, but you don't have to do that. Here's that same method written in 6 more lines. And it's way better. It's way more clear. It's the exact same code, but it's way better, right? Here I can immediately tell nothing's being returned. It's just running the expression. So I can tell from the signature nothing is being returned. I just use a val to hold the items that I want so that the naming convention is just a little bit easier to read. Instead of using that extension function, I just inline what I was doing. And all that extension function was doing a filter on a collection. And that extension function that I wrote was being used in one place. It was being used here. And then lastly, because I cut out that with expression, which I didn't really need because I assigned it to items, I could just call a nice clean do async. So it's just one lambda in there. So I show you these code examples to sort of help drive home the point that this is just one thing. This is kind of thing that bit me. But there's a lot of different ways that Kotlin could bite you if you get a little too enthusiastic about it. On a related note, keep an eye on your code organization, right? Kotlin lets you put anything anywhere. I think Josh alluded to this in his talk this morning. If you want, you can put everything in one file. So that's the kind of like crazy stuff you can do. You need to think about a little bit. How do you want to organize your constants? How do you want to organize your extension functions, your package level functions? I'm not saying go off and write a huge style guide and write a bunch of documentation on how you're going to do every little thing, but just keep an eye on it, because if you can get kind of loose on it. We're a two-person team. We're very small. We can just kind of talk to each other and figure it out. When you're 5, 10, 15 people in a much larger organization, this can get out of hand in a hurry if you don't kind of keep an eye on it. So just make sure that you sort of know where you're going to be putting your code. Just a couple small things to kind of put the wraps on this. Don't forget about your customers. It sounds maybe kind of obvious, but up to now, we've kind of talked about what are all the things that we can do to get more Kotlin into the code base to make you happy, right? What are all the ways that we can get you to write more Kotlin? And that's great, right? Programmer happiness is crucial. I think it's fundamentally one of the most important things, that you are happy in doing your work. And one of the things that makes you happiest, or is having a nice language to work with. The thing is, of course, there's a balance, right? And the balance is that your customers don't care. They do not care that your app is written in Kotlin. Hooray for you that you get there, but they could not care any less, right? They care that your app is fast, that it doesn't crash, it has all the features they want, it's not buggy. Those are the things they care about. And again, I know it sounds a little obvious, but like once you get in the rhythm, once you sort of get conversions going, it kind of gets fun. Like you want to do more of them. You want to kind of keep on a roll and doing that stuff. And it's easy to forget about what are those little bug fixes that we need to fix? What are those little performance tweaks we should be making? And I'm just going to go off over here and just get more Kotlin going. So just keep that in mind that it does happen. It definitely happened to me. But just keep that in mind. Last, but certainly not least, take your time. The best stuff that has ever been built anywhere in the world has taken time to do. Businesses, friendships, families, all that good stuff, all the best code you've ever written has taken time. Take your time. There's literally nothing good in this world that was created in a rush, right? There's no rush. Kotlin's not going anywhere, thanks to Google. Java's not going anywhere, so it's not a big deal if it takes you a little while to get there. For us, it took us 430 days, calendar days, to get all of our code to Kotlin. It's not a short period of time, but it's not a terribly long period of time either. But you have to consider the fact that our code base was pretty modern. It was only about a year and a half old by the time we started tackling all this Kotlin stuff. And it's also moderately sized. We use a lot of web views, and we rely on those a lot. So our native sort of code base is not necessarily as large as a lot of other apps. So your app might be bigger, it might be older, you might have a bigger team. There's all sorts of different considerations. So don't sweat how long it takes you. I'm always impatient. Even though I say take your time, I'm always in a rush, and I couldn't wait to sort of get there. But just take your time. And that 100% thing, just remember it's just a number. It makes for a nice talking point. I'm super happy that I never have to work in Java, so don't get me wrong. But if you don't get to 100%, don't worry about it. What you really want is that you want your day-to-day to be really good, right? You want your day-to-day to be the majority of your code that you work with is in Kotlin so that you can kind of achieve more. If there's a bunch of old code that never gets touched and literally never changes, who cares, right? Don't worry about it. So with that, I just want to say thanks. Thanks for coming to the talk. I also want to say thank you to the organizers of Android Summit for inviting me to talk. This is my first talk, and I really appreciate them taking a chance on me. Also, thank you to Women Who Code, who are doing great work supporting women in tech. And if anybody wants to talk about Kotlin at the reception or afterwards, or you can email me or tweet me, please come find me and talk to me. I'm serious. I always answer my emails. I'm happy to talk about Kotlin. I don't bite. The Android community has been super helpful and supportive of me, and I just want to be able to pay that back to all of you as well. So if you have any questions or you want to talk, please just come find me. I'm happy to talk to you as well. Thank you.